So, Richenda, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Craig. Just by way of background, I spent the first 5 years of my career doing EIAs. I was an air quality assessment person, and then I've been working in climate change for the last 10 years. So for me, coming to this event was a fascinating opportunity to bring these two worlds together. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about that. What I'm going to do is to try to very quickly address two questions by reference to work that we've been doing, as Craig says, with corporates, mostly with large fixed assets or complex supply chains, and with IFC, EBRD and the World Bank over the last couple of years. So I'm going to have sort of maximum 5 minutes on each of these questions. How useful is ESIA and EIA as a tool for integrating adaptation into project-level decision-making by the private sector? And then touching a bit on making resilient decisions in the face of uncertainties. And actually, Ralph has covered many of those points, so that'll speed me up on those bits, and I'll try to sort of say some slightly different things than the points that Ralph made, which I agree with very strongly. First thing, before I'm really going to spend most of my time focusing on the private sector, but just before I do, I just wanted to, of course, say that clearly the private sector functions within the context provided both by governments and by the funders of the projects that it's developing. And so obviously here we've been hearing this morning about SEA, sustainability appraisal, and clearly government SEA can really help to set the strategic framework within which project-specific EIAs get considered. And then obviously project funders have a different set of sort of roles and ways that they interact with the private sector, and the kinds of actions that they can take, both in terms of their country and sector strategies for investment, the way that they react to feasibility studies that come through from the private sector, as well as the SIAs, and the sort of environmental and social policies and safeguards that they have in place. And both of these actors have a very important role to play in promoting adaptation among the private sector. I often get asked by corporates, or told by corporates, nobody's asking me to think about adaptation, so why should I listen to you? So I think really everyone thinking about the roles that they can play in driving this agenda forward is a really key thing for me. I'm now really going to then sort of focus in on some of the work we've been doing looking at private sector adaptation specifically. And this is a diagram from work we're doing at the moment with a large corporate with expensive long-lived assets. And what we've been doing is looking at the phases in their asset life cycle, which you can see here shown at the top in the red, and thinking about working through with them what are the different kinds of processes and analyses that they undertake at different stages. And I imagine actually people at the back really can't see the words here. Apologies for that. But we have an awful lot of different kinds of analyses and processes that go on, of which ESIA and EIA is only one. So we have things like feasibility studies, the business model development. You know, is there a market for this product that we're going to be selling? How much is it going to cost us to produce this thing? We have engineering design decisions being made, cost estimating, contracts get formed, joint ventures, contractors get hired. And as you go through each of these steps, there are decision gates. And we've been told in no uncertain terms by this corporate that there is no way they want to go back and revisit a decision gate. Once you've gone through something, you've got to get it right, because the costs and the consequences of having to go back and revisit things can be absolutely enormous. Particularly when you get into this define stage where you've started to have contracts with external consultants, engineers, for instance, and changing any of the scope of those at this stage can have massive implications. So I'm just going to sort of romp through these a bit, but essentially the sort of the key message there is ESIA is a useful tool, but actually there are a heck of a lot of other decisions that are made where adaptation needs to be integrated right through to the decommissioning phase of these assets. And I'm just going to give a couple of examples of some work we've been doing with EBRD and IFC over the last couple of years to illuminate just one or 2 points. With EBRD, we've been looking at a brewery investment in the Caucasus and trying to understand how climate change could affect the success of this investment. And this is sort of a brief run through some of the issues that have emerged in that analysis. In this company, I think it's something like 50% of The direct operating costs are in the price of barley and about another 20% in the price of hops. So climate change impacts on the price and availability of those crops has a significant impact. We also found that a lot of their production machinery was sensitive to temperature increases and became less efficient. They're operating in an area where hydropower is one of the dominant forms of energy generation, and so energy security actually was a concern as well. And then they depend on transport networks for bringing raw materials in and for moving their product out. And they're in an area where a lot of natural hazards can affect the reliability of that transport network. And then finally, we also found that there was an interesting market demand angle. And this was a nice thing because it was a good news story. And this was a point actually Ralph Torrey was making earlier on. One of the issues we face with engaging business on adaptation is most of it seems like bad news. So we're always delighted when we can find an opportunity, even though we're conscious that it's in the context of a changing climate. But in the case of this organisation, we think that there's some evidence that the demand for their product is related to temperatures. So in warmer weather, people sit outside more and drink a few more beers of an evening. And in fact, there's experience of that from the European summer 2003 heatwave. Secondly, this is a project which Alan Miller mentioned yesterday in his talk. It's an IFC investment in Ghana. This one is an interesting one for me at demonstrating efficiency losses and revenue losses, and this is a refinery which needs a very, very strong vacuum in order to be able to produce the refined oils. And what we found is that the design of this refinery was designed for a particular threshold temperature, and it would work really well up to that threshold. After the threshold, the efficiency starts to drop off. The vacuum strength reduces and the efficiency drops off. And what we were able to demonstrate is that this efficiency drop-off, which they expect to happen only 2% of the time based on the historic design conditions, actually is going to go up to 10 times that by the 2020s due to rising temperatures. I just want to briefly mention BG Group, which is, I think, a nice example of a company that has mainstreamed adaptation. They're an energy company operating in around about 30 countries, and they've developed and implemented mandatory adaptation requirements. We work with them to develop a risk management framework for incorporating climate change resilience into new projects and existing assets. And one of the things that was interesting for me is that they also, as well as thinking about this as an engineering design issue, they were conscious of the fact of climate change affecting the communities and local environments near where they operate, and they were actually actively looking for opportunities to work together with those to identify adaptation strategies that would benefit both them and their wider stakeholders. Very quickly then, in terms of decision-making on climate change in the face of uncertainties, the cover of this report here is a report that IFC has just published, and I gather there's some copies available, and this picks up some of the messages from that report. Very often there's a lot of focus on the climate change uncertainties, and people can sometimes feel that they can't move ahead and make decisions because of those. What we find is that an incredibly useful first step is to think through the critical thresholds that link some aspect of your performance back to climate. And if you can identify those, then when you look at the climate change projections, you may find that all the projections are below, all are above, and actually the uncertainty in the projections goes away as a problem for you. So starting from the viewpoint of what matters to us, what affects us, rather than starting from the climate science end, I think is absolutely essential way to approach this. Ralph talked about 90 climate change projections in their work. This is slightly fewer number. This is part of a project we did with IFC in Pakistan, and what we tried to do here was to form some sort of sense of the frequency distribution across different climate models and emission scenarios when we were looking at groundwater recharge. The difference between the top and the bottom of these two graphs is two different groundwater recharge models, and this is another point I wanted to make. I think that the EIA community and all sorts of other communities have got very used to trusting their own impact assessment models. I know when I used to do air quality assessments, we basically used one industry standard model for assessing air quality, and we kind of, didn't play around anymore. But what this shows us here is that the choice of impact model actually has a massive difference in terms of your view of the outcome. So I would say everyone talks about climate change uncertainties, but there are lots of other uncertainties in your other models, and they should be part of your focus of attention as well. Again, Ralph has made a very, very strong and clear pitch for adaptive management, and I just wanted to mention a very interesting project in the UK called Thames Estuary 2100, which is looking at how the flood defences along the River Thames, which protect London and the southeast of England, should be upgraded over time. And they essentially reach the same sort of decision as Ralph is talking about. If this were risk, ignoring climate change, doing nothing in terms of adaptation, then there are two strategies they could adopt. One is to do some massively expensive adaptation very early on that would provide the standard of protection for the whole century, or they could take this adaptive management approach of taking sort of incremental steps through time. Glenn Watts from the Environment Agency is here, and I think he's speaking later on, and he would be able to talk a lot more about that. And then finally, I've talked about sort of technical ways of making decisions in the face of uncertainty, but my final point was actually, participatory approaches to these problems will get you a very long way in getting over the uncertainties. Decision makers know their own worlds very much better than scientists do. And again, Ralph made this point about the need for interactions between researchers and decision makers. This is a diagram from a tool that we've developed recently with the World Bank called HEAT, a Hands-on Energy Adaptation Toolkit. And that's available on the World Bank website. And that's an example of how you work through a participatory approach. So that's my conclusion. Those are my two answers to the two questions I posed. ESIA and EIA is a useful tool, but it's not enough on its own. And then we can make decisions in the face of uncertainty. Thank you very much.